The events which I will narrate now begin simultaneously with the crusades of the Hyde Knights and the plot of the Warlocks, in the distant past before Havel and Olafis had become Alken and Ven. From the side of Olafis, the Apostles of Lydia would ring the bells to disrupt the rest of the dead in order to raise an army of Firelinkers. In response, the Lydia witches rebelled against Firelinking, for they worshipped Galeb, the god of death, and their faith had intuitively developed into a desire to spread the plague, as Nito, the Allfather of the dead, the being Galeb is based on, had done in ancient times. For this reason, they'd gatekeep the crypts to prevent undead from entering, as well as to prevent the awakened from leaving. They wanted to halt Firelinking by blocking the reincarnation of undead who'd journey to link the fire. As an aside, within the crypt are various statues of Galeb, that is, Nito, depicted as an elderly man, standing above statues of Kaita, that is, Velka, denoting their father-daughter dynamic. This conflict would be solved by the Finito, who'd punish both sides for having disrupted the crypt's natural cycle. The witches were turned into corporeal slaves, sentenced to forever protect the entrance to the crypt from malicious invaders. Hence the apostles had their spirits enslaved, sentenced to forever safeguard the effigies, preventing disturbances to the slumbering man. From Havel's side, an order of holy knights from the southwest invaded the crypt in an attempt to disrupt Firelinking. In response, an order of knights from the southwest would organize themselves to gatekeep it from the invaders. The invading knights were high-ranking clerics, and conjured the Soul Appease miracle to dispose of undead. This miracle conjures lights to specifically damage those who don't possess it, the Hollows, the so-called agents of the dark. The defending knights wielded two extremely durable great shields made from the Dark Crow's mineral. They blocked the corridors of the crypt with their pairs of shields, which were as massive and strong as an iron gate. Their shields portray Orma, that is, Velka, who judges the guilty in the afterlife, and Reeve, that is, one of her Dark Moon Knights, who punishes them accordingly. This conflict too would be solved by the Finito, who'd punish both sides for having disrupted the crypt's natural cycle. The invading knights were branded insolent, and their spirits were enslaved, sentenced to eternally punish those who cast light within the crypt, like they had done. And the defending knights were branded Imperials, and sentenced to eternally gatekeep the crypt from malicious invaders with their robust bodies. The dark appearance of the Imperials knights contrasts with that of the insolent knights. Though the dark-looking shield-bearers were defending Firelinking, which is, as previously alluded to, the path of the Christian, of the saint, of the archetypal Christ, and the so-called Holy Knights were fighting to spread death and curse. The Abyss is the closest ally of those who want to end the linking of the flame, for it is short-sighted and can only desire to spread itself in the short term, absorbing all life it can. As I have and will demonstrate time and time again, the Abyss only manifested itself as a force of corruption in response to Gwyn's actions, and its agents, the true agents of the dark, are the greatest opposers of Firelinking, alongside the inheritors of Gwyn's will, which is why they collaborate, sometimes deliberately. The wars that raged on the Undead Crypt would wake the demon of song from its slumber. He'd learned to mimic the lullaby of the Milf Nito, which he'd employed to attract undead to his lair, so he could devour them. This would interrupt the activities of the crypt, because the demon now stood as its gatekeeper. The following events begin simultaneously with the rise of Ven's empire and with its downfall. The survivors of the flood which ruined Havel's southwest were now homeless, accursed undead who had been thrown down the gutter, forever confined to the filthy underworld. From their midst, two courageous undead would rise against the curse and journey through the lands with the goal of attaining a gleaming soul to link the fire with. One was named Pharros, and he'd leave many contraptions to aid those in need, especially other journeying undead like him. He'd built dozens of secret chambers, where he'd store the treasures his traveling partner would loot. The name of the partner was Flynn, which means descendant of Flann, Flann meaning blood red, crimson. Flann, as previously explained, is Gwyn's firstborn, the god of flame, whose name was corrupted in the New World as Faram, and later lost completely. The chambers would be locked with a mechanism known as a Door of Pharros, a giant stone lock, its visual representing a hollow's face, that would only open through the insertion of a lockstone. One of his most notable inventions was the poison-spitting mechanism he'd add to the effigies of Velka, which were so abundant in the gutter. He turns them into tools for the denizens' protection, which goes together with Velka's will of caring for the downtrodden. And the statues spit poison, which is the blood of undead, their sacrifices being employed to help their brethren, like the bonfire, which was Velka's invention, is fueled by the bones of martyred undead. Both Pharros and Flynn would be idolized by legend for their achievements, one as a courageous explorer helpful to those in sincere and dire need, and the other as a Robin Hood type figure, a thief who'd steal to give back to the meek. They'd clear the four corners of the continent. There is a door of Pharros even in the frigid outskirts, the northern limit where the undead of Elion Lois were sent in exile. Among their noblest accomplishments was their help toward the rats. Pharros would stumble upon the Rat King, and after learning of the oath man had broken, he'd be convinced to help the rats safeguard their lair, an honorable gesture to mend the mistakes of men. He'd build many traps to rouse the grave of saints, which would be used by members of the Rat Covenant he would help develop. Flynn would forge the poison-enhancing ring which the Rat King would give to his new subjects. As Pharros travels through the Rat King's territory, building many traps along the way, he'd stumble upon the Gyrm, his neighbors. The Gyrm, a people named after Gyrms, for their uncleanliness, used to be the workers who excavated the sewers and underground watercourses of Heide. They were the ones who provided water for the desert lands of Olafis, who sent clean water in the way to their fountains. However, they'd never be allowed to return to the surface, for the filth they endured in their line of work had affected their physiognomy, turning them into sturdy, but small-sized, simple-minded demi-humans, like the pygmies, the primitive ancestors of man. As a result of their honesty and hard work, they were unfairly sentenced to permanent exile by the very man who had hired them. In their exile, they'd build and build without an objective in mind, for that is all they knew how to do. They ended up producing one of the most beautiful places in the world, though one marked by the tragedy of its builders. Pharros would build many traps to protect their territory from invaders, and teach the Gyrm how to operate them, as well as hideouts to both hide them and their goods, many of which were gifts from Flynn. He's the man responsible for the booby traps within the chest of the New World. During his travels, Pharros would learn the secret of a forbidden relationship and be moved by the passion of the two lovers. He'd protect their meeting places with his contraptions, hiding their entrances. After having traveled through the four corners of the continent, the pair would be mesmerized by what they perceived to be the promised land their people needed. Below the deepest stretch of the gutter, known as the Black Gulch, for the dark liquid which flowed through it, a tar-like, flammable, abyssal substance, they'd be met with a wondrous sight, an underground haven. Waterfalls of immaculate water rained through the walls of the cave, and its roof was abundant with roots of arch trees, which the pair would quickly find to be highly nutritious. Dried roots restore HP for an extended duration. Even more impressive was the cause for such an immaculate environment to exist just beyond the foulest places. A dragon, which had been absorbing the impurities of the underworld and containing them within itself, like a nature-made saint, was slumbering at its core. The two friends were convinced this was the place they wanted for their people. They'd halt their fire-linking ambition and return to the gutter, and lead the now indigent masses of undead in an exodus to the perennial, subterranean paradise. Upon completing their migration, they founded Shulva, the Sanctum City, a name derived from the Hebrew word Shulva, meaning peace and serenity, which serves to further reference the exodus of the Jews of the Old Testament. Pharros was elected as their king for his merits, and for the immense soul he had amassed during his expansive journey. Shulva would develop a faith that based itself on retellings of the older tales of the gods, through the miracle scrolls its people had managed to salvage from the ruins of their flooded country, and the worship of the slumbering dragon, who they fittingly saw as their savior. They'd build a holy wall, an intricately crafted mural that depicted their kingdom's story, with Sihn as its center, to shelter the dragon, and the priestesses would sing a lullaby to preserve its deep slumber. The inhabitants of Shulva would create an abundant supply of medicine and supplements through the roots which blessed their land. The dried roots and the balms, as well as through the nigh-immortal essence of the slumbering dragon, the dragon charms, which can both heal and cure poison. Pharros would fill the city with his contraptions as a means of safeguarding it from invaders. He'd also create new ones, such as the iconic magnetic towers, which can double as hiding spots and watchtowers for its sentinels. Those that were close to hollowing were taken to the Cave of the Dead, where statues of Velka, which Pharros has turned into tools for the safety of his people, like the poison-spitting effigies, would petrify their bodies, preventing the curse from spreading. An idea Pharros got from his exploration of the Grave of Saints, where the rats would bite and petrify the corpses of the dead to prevent them from rising from their graves. Hidden within the grotto rested the reincarnated soul of an old one, the great soul of the father of the dead, Nito. The power of that soul was behind the formation of the magnetic ores exclusive to the cave, which, in reference to Nito's necromantic powers, allowed the special, segmented weapons forged from it to separate and rebuild themselves. The ore also powers the contraptions that move the various pillars of Shulva. Elana, a reincarnation of the great soul of Manus, the father of the Abyss, of his wrath, whose name, which derives from Elena, ironically means light or shining, would be intuitively attracted to the powerful soul of Shulva's sovereign. She'd suddenly appear before him, and just as suddenly make him enamored with her, for the dark is a powerful temptation. Elana, who presented herself as a priest, though she was a priest of darkness, would come to the king with a Faustian bargain. She'd tell him of a way to attain eternal life. Elana would extensively subvert their culture, which stood for the safety and protection of the distressed. She would teach the priests of Shulva the dark arts. Through them, they'd produce an army of untouchable spirit warriors, their seals having been linked to an effigy through a bloodletting ritual. The priestesses of Shulva would be subverted into becoming witches, and its soldiers had a hex cast on their crossbows, enabling them to shoot dark orbs. Of course, Elana's aim was to suppress the Abyss. She plans to create an army to conquer the worlds to establish an empire of darkness. Shulva would also produce red-eye orbs through dark rituals that involved human sacrifice, which they'd use to invade and kill men to spread death and prevent firelinking. The people of Shulva would extract the souls of the living for themselves, transcending life through the same means the dark wraiths had employed before them. Shulva's ziggurat is a reference to the pyramids of the Mesoamerican peoples who conducted rituals of human sacrifice and ate the hearts of the sacrificed to absorb their vigor. Adorning the exterior of Shulva's buildings are depictions of its people as Mesoamerican pagans. Such murals stand in sharp contrast to those found in the interiors of the same buildings, which depicts them as one would expect, in line with the design of their holy wall. The newly engraved external murals are indicative of a development not merely of their artistic sensibilities, but of their culture. The Sanctum City underwent a descent into violent paganism. Elana's design looks like a rotting tree, trees being symbols of prosperity and life, which, when rotted, become symbols of corruption and death. The design of her axe is based on the unrefined catalyst wielded by Manus, which, like the axe, scales with strength. She can summon mud impressions of beings she fought against in the past, including those of fallen warriors, those which invaded Shulva, and Velstad, who she'd later face during Vendrick's travel to the Sunken City. Pharros' journey mirrors that of the chosen Undead, with Flynn being a cooperator, and his intention was to link the fire after Shulva's founding, to become the first true king of the New World. But the materialistic paradise he had built, alongside Elana's bargain, had convinced him to betray his noble ambition and rule as a Dark Lord with power over death. And so, an archetypal Christ turned into an archetypal Antichrist, an arc which mirrors Gwyn's, who at first fought for the emancipation of mankind, but later betrayed it. A new wave of migrants invaded the eastern shores of the continent. The immigrants consisted mostly of displaced knights of Baldur and Katarina, their leader being Jorg, whose name derives from York, meaning wild boar, a reference to his strength, courage, and relentlessness, as well as to the boars that inhabited his old homeland in Lordran. Jorg commanded his own company of knights, the Drakeblood Knights. They had migrated from Lordran to hide, to see for themselves if the rumors about the existence of an ancient dragon in the continent were true. If they were to find that dragon, they'd slay it and drink its sacrosanct blood to attain true immortality. Jorg's forces quickly took over the Cardinal Tower, and later the Tower of Flame, confining Mira to the Sunless Realms, that is, the Huntsman Copse. They'd loot the lands they conquered, and the Drakeblood Knights would equip the Spirit Tree shields they got from pillaging the Church of Blue. Then, Yorg would lead a small army of knights toward the holy city of Shulva, which in accordance with the stories they had heard, was where the slumbering dragon rested. His knights invaded the Underworld Kingdom, and Shulva's labyrinthic configuration along with its traps and contraptions proved insufficient, and its military faltered, allowing the Drakeblood Knights to loot their way through the city and reach their holy wall that guards the ancient dragon. Upon reaching the wall, Yorg would be faced with Pharros, the king himself. They would fight to the death, and Pharros would fall, and the victor would claim his crown. Yorg would penetrate the wall and find his ultimate prize behind it. Wishing to bathe himself in sacrosanct blood, he'd stab the dragon's chest with his spear, and the blood he desired, spilled as a miasma of death and disease, for the dragon contains the toxins that emanated from Nito's soul, that in a matter of moments ravaged Shulva. Yorg wouldn't survive the incident, and the crown which he had claimed was eaten alongside him by Sihn, the dragon whose name references the great sin that was inflicted upon it, and the kingdom he supported. The slumbering dragon, which, when asleep, acted as Christ, would become like the beast of Revelation upon its wake, a metaphor for the positive and negative uses for the raw energy of nature. In Shulva, the Drakeblood Knights were met with a mirror, which reflected their hedonistic ways. After their campaign against the Sanctum City, which served as the symbolic death of their hero's journey, they were able to advance to the next step toward Gnosis. The dead body of Pharros was taken to the Cave of the Dead by Elana, but instead of being petrified and allowed to rest for eternity, it was made to reincarnate the soul of an old one which rested within the grotto. The great soul of the first of the dead, Nito. The soul's influence first manifested itself as a nurturing force, in reference to Nito's nurturing character for his family of dead. But as Shulva was subverted, the effects of Nito's soul would be as well, and it now manifested itself as a wrathful, death-spreading curse, which would possess the king of the then sacred city. From a combination of the corpses of the dead with the abyssal tar of the Black Gulch and the Old One's reincarnated soul, Elana built a monstrosity, the being who would be called the Rotten. The Rotten would crawl back to the Black Gulch to protect the entrance of Shulva from invaders, while Elana would work to rebuild her army from the dead, still with the aim of conquering the world and establishing an abyssal empire. As previously inferred, Elana was like a Satan who Pharros made a deal with. So, even after the death of his body, his soul would be made an eternal slave by her. The Rotten is like a mass of sinners who were sentenced to suffer in hell, surrounded by omens of the goddess of sin who judged them, by effigies of Velka, the founder of Firelinking, a duty which they betrayed. Despite having been reduced to a mere slave butcher made of dark and dead flesh, the Rotten still bore the essence of the old ruler of Shulva within. Regardless of its faded consciousness, the monster continuously struggles to fix the broken Velka statues scattered through his lair, in a vain effort of wielding the forces of creation he had mastered in the past, when he came so close to attaining the final Gnosis. Upon defeating him, the bearer of the curse finally grants peace to a man who fell prey to evil, but yearned for and warranted redemption. The mask of Pharros is strikingly similar to the mask of the Father from Dark Souls 1. Strangely, tears continually flow from its eyes, soaking its owner in them, for Pharros was like an all-father to the undead, and mourned for their suffering. His character arc mirrors Nito's, for he was, at first, a nurturing caretaker of the dead, but ended up becoming a plague spreader, whose ambition to rule over the world required him to become an agent of death itself. The sacredness of the city and Pharros' kingship over it are also connected to Nito's role as Allfather Lloyd, the main deity of the ancient way of white religion, who ruled over his underworld empire. Near the bonfire at the entrance of the Black Gulch are 3 holes, which form the face of a hollow. As an aside, each Old One's soul that reincarnated in the New World would act as a Faustian bargain. They'd first be employed as tools for the prosperity of nations, embodying the positive aspects of the former lords. But as the nations themselves were corrupted, so would the souls that rested below them, and one would influence the other in a loop of energetic exchanges. Shulva would, after its downfall, be a subject of fascination among explorers and thieves. 3 of them would manage to reach the Cave of the Dead in search of the great soul of an old one, which according to rumor was hidden there, but found nothing, as the bulk of the soul had been claimed by Elana to create the Rotten, and remains there forever in a fitting punishment for their greed. With their leader dead, The surviving Drakeblood knights fled the calamity and resurfaced from the depths. As they arrived at the Tower of Flame, they'd make a pact among them. They'd bury their story alongside the kingdom that had sunken into ruin and found a country, which they'd call Lindelt, a name composed by the word Lane, which means to recite religious texts, and Dell, which means valley among trees. As a curiosity, Leyndell, from Elden Ring, shares this etymology. Lindelt and Leyndell are essentially the same name. Lindelt would be a theocracy, which the Drakeblood Knights, who'd become its clergy, the most powerful social class of the country, their religious texts having been looted from the sunken city, would rule with strict authority. They established their headquarters at Havel's ancient castle in the northwest, which hid the Dragon Shrine, as they had also heard rumors of a dragon egg hidden within it. At the shrine, they'd build a replica of the Holy Wall of Shulva, where the petrified egg of the dragons was stored, a direct reference to the configuration of Shulva's mural in relation to the slumbering dragon. They hoped to hatch the egg, so they could amend their shameful sin by caring for the being who'd truly be the last of its kind, should it wish to be born. They'd also wish to mend their sin by aiding Firelinking, the journey of the supreme martyrs who'd atone for the sins of their fellow men, with the aim of restoring nature's cycles and empowering both men and the dragons. Lindelt would recreate the rings of sacrifice, which Velka had pioneered in Lordran. They would be spread through the continent, and aid many future travelers who wished to link the fire. They'd explore the fallen Seldora, and there, aspiring scholars would study sorcery in secret. At first, that is, for the art was prohibited by the country's strict laws. However, as Lindelt realized the usefulness of sorcery, seeing it as a means of solving the undead curse, the highest-ranking members of their clergy, the very men who had founded the country and were the keepers of its history, hypocritically wished to master it. Those men would form the Archdrake sect, a sect that venerated Sith, the Pale Drake, which would justify its integration into Lindelt's society of dragon worshippers. The Bright Stone of Theodora would be mined for its use on the tip of the staves, which would be wielded by the Archdrake sect, and later by the staves which would be wielded by the Amana Priestesses. Hence, to adorn their armors, whose design references Sith, their helmets bearing a sculpture of him realized as a fuller being, and their shields depicting a serpent which has acquired wings. Lindelt would often send members of the sect, many of whom wanted to escape their homeland's authoritarian rule, in pilgrimage to the Undead Crypt. Holy women who studied sorcery would also be sent on pilgrimage to the Crypt. They'd become known as Amana Priestesses, and would protect the shrine from malicious invaders, conjuring spells of the long-lost Olafis, which they studied. Their dresses refer to Lydia's design, the ancient queen of Olafis. The blue-dripping cloth attached to their hoods represents tears of mourning for the dead, as well as the light, the golden text, traveling downward. The horns they wear on their heads, which are simply white tree branches, are both a reference to the deer, which Lydia's clan had as a symbol, that represents resurrection, and the chains and DNA strands depicted on their loincloths and capes, alongside the dragon's head, are symbols of their covenants of firelinking. The pilgrims would attempt to appease the demon of song with sacrifice. They blamed the Nito for the demon's behavior, thinking they had purposely taught it to sing, and so they'd capture them and feed them to the monster instead of allowing it to feed on the undead of the crypt. This would allow the crypt to continue its activities undisturbed by the monster. And this is the end of this episode. Thank you for watching. If you want to support my work, you can join my Patreon, which is linked below.